When it comes to Space Marines, they're sold to us as the most incredible, badass, unstoppable killing machine that's ever existed. That's why they're the poster boys of Warhammer 40,000, and rightfully so. There's been some hints and teasers that we may see Chaos Space Marines as an enemy someday in Darktide, and this has become a big point of contention for a lot of people, not just amongst Darktide players, but the 40k community in general. Many people think that there isn't a universe where the rejects can or should be able to fight and win against a single basic Space Marine, much less a Plague Marine, which are Nurgle followers and notoriously tougher. Trying to determine a hard line or point of reference for power scaling, or who could win in a fight against whom in 40k, is kind of completely useless, but that doesn't mean that people don't try to argue it all the time. If you dig into Warhammer lore and actually look at Space Marines across all their depictions in books, shows, video games, and today we'll be looking at especially the tabletop because it's the only place where we get actual measurable numbers. I hate to say it, but you'll come to find that a single Space Marine is a chump and the rejects could wipe the floor with him easily. Obey my cat! Hit the subscribe button. To defend my stance, I want to start off by laying some lore foundation that supports my argument. When you look to the decades of lore to try and get a grasp on what the capabilities of a single Space Marine is, things get really inconsistent. They can face off against the most powerful of Tyranids like the Patriarch single-handedly and live to tell the tale. A single Space Marine can take on an entire invasion force of chaos. They can stand against the greatest demonic forces of the war and banish them back to the pits that spawned them. The physical might and utter fear a single Space Marine can and should strike into the heart of anyone can't be overstated, depending on your source material. On the other end of the spectrum are examples like that time a Space Marine was killed by a pointy stick. I am not making that up. This excerpt is from chapter 29 of the novel First Heretic by Aaron Dembski Bowden. What of Sarfareth? Dead. What? Killed 10 months ago, shortly after you left. Slain by a human of all things. An unlucky thrust with a wooden spear. Argel Tull tapped 2 fingers against his neck. Tore out most of his throat. Laid it bare to the bone. I've never seen anything like it. Blood of the gods, I'd have laughed if it hadn't been so pathetically tragic. He bled out before the apothecaries could reach him, still trying to shout the whole time. Basic guardsmen can and do routinely kill Space Marines in combat armed with nothing more than las guns in lore, just like Sergeant Major Morrow and his squad of no-hopers that took down a whole-ass hound of Angron.
Run! What the hell is that, Sarge?
That's death, pure and simple.
Fucking hell! It's seen us!
All right now, Opus. Weapons up. Bring it down.
Darktide itself has laid the foundation that it does not consider a Chaos Space Marine to be an unkillable demigod, and that's just with what seems to be a small squad of basic las rifle wielding soldiers. Morrow didn't have the God Emperor's favorite crackheads armed with a sharp pipe and a rock on that day, and Khorne himself should probably be relieved that he didn't, because Darktide's rejects wouldn't have just beat that hound, they would have embarrassed him. Our rejects kill beasts of Nurgle by the dozens, knock down thousands of enemies in a single encounter, coup de grace carapace-clad ogrins in a few hits to the noggin, and send so many demon hosts back to the warp they probably have started a support group in the Garden of Nurgle. So if the rejects can do that, where is the line on what they can't handle? Great question, and technically there isn't a hardline answer. But something that I kind of kicked a hornet's nest on was pointing out that Terminator squads have been called out in Darktide. Based on what we know about Fatshark stance for player Space Marines, it seems more likely that if this tease ends up meaning anything at all, it would be Chaos Terminators, as in enemies that we might fight. And boy oh boy did I hear from the comments section about how it's ridiculous that the rejects could reasonably fight a single single Chaos Space Marine, much less a Terminator, which, as we just went over briefly, the lore support for that is dubious at best. Instead, I prefer an approach using one of the few systems that gives us hard numbers. It's a system that we actually know from Fatshark devs they do look to for information and guidance when it comes to power scaling: the tabletop game.
You guys have a lot of weapons and tools and stuff like that. Do you guys look at the codexes and like kind of go, okay, so this gun's super powerful, this is what AP2 is? Like, do you guys look at that stuff when you're adding stuff into the game and try to make it as close to the codex right as possible?
Yes, I currently have a codex on my desk back in Sweden. I won't tell you why, but I am looking at some stuff, yeah.
Now, the tabletop game is meant to be balanced so that any faction could have a fighting chance against another. Notice that I stressed meant to be balanced because, as anyone who has actually played the tabletop game for any amount of time will tell you, that really couldn't be further from the actual truth. Something that the tabletop game does do reasonably well, however, is balancing the game around the ideas and in-universe strategies that different factions employ in war. Space Marines are a very solid middle-of-the-road faction in 10th edition, and you might be wondering how we're going to measure how well they might perform against Darktide's rejects if the rejects themselves don't actually have any models on the tabletop. Except they kind of do. In 10th edition, there's a selection of models that have current official rules and pretty well mirror our original non-DLC character reject squad. So let's meet the rejects. Actually, first up, let's learn some basic terms for those who have never played the tabletop game before, because it's important. In the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop game, models in your army have different stats for both attacking and defending. Your models come with different options for weapons they're allowed to have attached to them, and typically you only get one ranged weapon option and one melee weapon option per model. There's some exceptions to that, but typically that's how it works. Once you've decided what weapons you'll use on each model, you'll use a data sheet when you go to attack an enemy to know all the pertinent information that determines how effective your attacks are at actually hitting and damaging any given enemy. On weapons, A stands for attacks, which is literally how many times your model can use that weapon to make an attack during the combat phase. On ranged weapons, BS means ballistic skill, aka how accurate your shots are. WS for melee weapons is weapon skill, or how proficient your model is with that weapon. S is for strength, meaning how hard your weapon punches against an enemy. AP means armor penetration, which is any extra advantages your weapon has to actually piercing armor. And finally, D is damage, and that's just how many wounds the weapon is capable of dishing out. All these weapon stats are then put up against the target enemy's defensive values. On the defense side, T stands for toughness, and is how well your model resists getting hurt when the enemy successfully hits them, and this is compared against the attacking weapon's strength. For example, if you have a model with a toughness of 3 and the enemy is attacking with a strength 4 weapon, your opponent would roll a 6-sided die and need to roll a 3 or higher in order to have a chance at wounding your model. Then there's W, which is wounds, which is essentially hit points on your model. It's literally how many times they can take a wound before your model dies and is removed from combat. Obviously, these systems are loosely represented in Darktide, with toughness being an overshield that helps mitigate damage enemies can do to player characters, and wounds being how many times your character can go into a downed state before outright dying. Lastly, in the tabletop game, there's saving throws. When an enemy model attacks yours and makes it through your toughness, you have another opportunity to roll a die and get a Hail Mary on not actually taking a wound from the attack. Save values are shown on tabletop model data sheets as 5+, 6+, etc. This means that for a 5+ save, when you roll a 6-sided die, you need to roll a 5 or higher to pass your save check. If you manage to pull that off, then it's similar to having your armor save your life when taking a shot, or you had an old Nokia phone in your chest plate that was able to deflect a sword. Alright, now that we know some of the basics of 40k tabletop gaming, now let's meet the rejects. First up, we'll start with the Veteran. I personally think the closest unit in 10th edition Warhammer to Darktide's Veteran is the Commander unit, and since we can make our characters from this planet specifically, I'm choosing the Cadian Commander. Commanders have a toughness of 3, making them pretty average for toughness in terms of tabletop units. They come with 3 wounds, which is considerably tankier than the standard Guardsman's normal 1, which compared to what we see in Darktide seems appropriate. With a saving throw of 5+, they don't stand a fantastic chance at surviving hits. They have the Voice of Command ability at their disposal and an arsenal of weapons that include hits we use in Darktide like bolt pistols, las guns, las pistols, plasma guns, and chainswords. And we'll just ignore the list of fabulous weapon additions that are just being sat on instead of added into Darktide for some reason. On top of having these familiar weapons and abilities, Cadian Commanders also come equipped with metapacks in their war gear, a familiar piece of equipment that our characters in Darktide can deploy on the fly in missions for extra health. Well, not a perfect match, and none of these will be because Darktide's characters weren't designed purely off the tabletop game. It's one of the best matches we have in 10th edition Warhammer. Next up, we have our favorite giant goodest boy, the Ogryn. Ogryn bodyguards are individual character units that have both 6 toughness and wounds, double that of the veterans. He also gets a feel no pain save of 6+, which allows him an extra opportunity to roll to ignore taking wounds in combat that most other models don't get, making him even hardier. For weapons, our Ogryn bodyguard can take a Grenadier Gauntlet or Ripper Gun for his ranged options, and a Bulgrin Maul, generic close combat weapon, huge knife, or use your Ripper Gun to beat the shit out of enemies in melee. Moving on to the next member of the team, the Zealot. In the tabletop, the closest model to representing Darktide Zealot is the Ministorum Priest. They have 3 toughness and 3 wounds, putting them on the same level as Veteran for how tanky they are, but they get an extra feature called an invulnerable save. In the 40k tabletop, some weapons specify that they ignore armor, making it so your model wouldn't get their normal saving throw when hit. Generally, this would mean that your model is Kentucky Fried fucked, but in cases of models where they have an invuln save, they get to make a saving throw no matter what and try to avoid taking a wound from the attack. In the case of the Ministorum Priest, their invuln save value is rolling a 4 or higher on a die, which isn't too bad. This helps represent the fact that Zealots are a bit harder to kill in Darktide than the other 2 standard human characters. I tend to think of this as a stand-in for the Until Death ability on their skill tree. Their core and combat abilities don't really translate well in what we see in Darktide's gameplay, which is fine. They're able to do extra damage and help allies do extra damage, which all of Darktide's player characters typically have auras and other buffs that help them do that. But what stands out about the Ministorum Priest is that for their arsenal, they can take a Holy Pistol, which has a similar weapon profile to the Bolt Pistol, and a power weapon, so that's things like our Relic Blade. Or you can give your Priest model a weapon called a Vindicator, which is a flamethrower. A Vindicator is a bit more extra compared to the Zealot's flamethrower, but since that is a class-specific weapon for them in Darktide and so iconic, it was important to me that it's represented. Last but certainly not least, we have the Psyker model, which in 10th edition is going to be the Primaris Psyker. They're the same squishiness as the Veteran model with 3 toughness and 3 wounds and a 5+ saving throw. However, they come with some extra tricks up their sleeve you'll find familiar. First of all, the tabletop model has an ability called Psychic Barrier, which they can put up and try to protect themselves and other models in their unit from enemy gunfire. For melee combat, they have a Force weapon, so this would be something like the Blaze Force swords that are single-handed swords or the Great Sword. The Primaris Psyker is one of those rare exceptions in the tabletop where they have multiple ranged attacks they can choose from to use in the shooting phase of combat. They're equipped with a las pistol or their psychic powers, and it really isn't a competition on which one is the better option to use. Psychic Maelstrom attacks are extremely extremely powerful and granted extra buffs to penetrate enemy armor, as well as having a chance to inflict something called devastating wounds. When the attacks for Psychic Maelstrom are rolled, any attacks that are critical hits mean that they cause devastating wounds, which denies the enemy target both their regular saving throw or an invulnerable saving throw, which is inflicting a type of wound called a mortal wound, so it's extra nasty. Alright, so we have our 4 Darktide reject characters that are the best representations we can find in the 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 tabletop game. I'm not including our BDs or Hive Scum, this is purely going to be the original rejects. Including the bonus classes would mean needing to cobble together rules from completely different games and make my life significantly more complicated, and homie, don't play that. So yeah, here's our rejects, they're awesome. Now, we just need something for them to fight. In the actual game, Darktide's rejects hack and slash their way through countless enemies, hordes upon hordes of Poxwalkers, carapace-clad ogrins, and even one of the most disgustingly resilient enemies that all of Warhammer 40k has to offer, the Beast of Nurgle. They seem nigh unstoppable in the video game, but how does that stack up to how they would perform in the tabletop? Let's put it to the test. This is Unit Crunch, a Warhammer 40,000 tabletop combat simulator that lets you add your attacking models and defending models and run thousands of combat simulations at once for statistically significant outcomes, detailing how many wounds were successfully delivered, how many models were killed, and the overall likelihood of an attacker killing a defender in any given engagement. Everyone say hi, Unit Crunch! Hi, Unit Crunch! This is going to be our new best friend for the next several minutes. First, we're going to put together our reject squad along with their weapon loadouts. For Veteran, we're going to give him an overcharged plasma rifle for his ranged attack and a chainsword for his melee. He won't be getting any crack grenades because it's a command phase thing, which I can't even represent in this battle sim, so we're just not going to deal with that. This means compared to how veterans are portrayed in actual Darktide, our tabletop veteran is going to be a little underpowered. For our Zealot, if they take the Vindicator, which is the tabletop version of the flamethrower, they are required to take that one weapon and use it for both their ranged and melee combat options. Even though that isn't true in Darktide, we can take both a flamethrower and a Thunderhammer, for example. I am going to be good and play by the rules because the tabletop game informs Darktide, not the other way around. Our Ogren Bodyguard will be equipped with one of his standard loadouts in 10th edition tabletop, the Ripper Gun and the Huge Knife. And for the Psyker, she'll be using her focused Witchfire Psychic Maelstrom, which I personally like to think of as the Brain Burst, and have a basic force weapon for melee fighting. So with that out of the way, our rejects are ready to fight. And what better to start them out with on combat than something nice and simple, really ease them into it. Something like, oh, I don't know, 10 Poxwalkers. This should be a cakewalk. The rejects slay Poxwalkers all day long. Let's run this simulation and see how they do. Uh-oh. That's not good. If you don't know how to read the results here, that's okay, you're not alone. What this chart is telling us is that in the 40,000 instances of this combat simulation being run, when our reject squad attacks a horde of 10 Poxwalkers, they successfully kill them in ranged combat about 2.5% of the time, and in melee combat roughly around 1% of the time, for a total of about a 3% chance to successfully kill the entire horde of 10 Poxwalkers. They dunk on at least 5 of them if you factor both melee and ranged combat, and stand a pretty good chance of killing at least a total of 6, but it dramatically drops off after that. Probably not exactly the result that a lot of you who don't play the tabletop were expecting, right? But let's see how our squad does when being attacked by the Poxwalkers. Okay, so the Poxwalkers aren't able to kill any of the rejects. That's great news because even if the rejects can't kill the whole horde in one turn, the Poxwalkers can't do shit to them, and the rejects can just regroup and finish them off in the next round and possibly continue that performance for a prolonged amount of time without having to worry too much about unit losses because the Poxwalkers statistically dish out just one little wound worth of health to the entire entire team in roughly 40% of combat engagements, as this chart here shows us, which overall, as a representation for what fighting Poxwalkers is like in Darktide, that's not a terrible mark of it. Let's move on to something significantly harder though. We see the Darktide operatives eat these guys for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but how do the Darktide rejects fare on the tabletop against a Beast of Nurgle? Beasts of Nurgle on the tabletop are some of the most difficult enemies to fight, and that's because it has an ability called grotesque regeneration. What that means is that at the end of any combat phase on the tabletop, if the Beast of Nurgle has taken damage but hasn't been killed outright, it regains all of its wounds back. And thank God that's not how the Burgle works in Darktide, because I'm pretty sure if it started rapidly regaining all of its health after a few seconds of not taking damage, we all would have punched holes in the nearest solid surface to us and uninstalled the game by now. Instead, Beasts of Nurgle can eat other enemy units in Darktide and gain a little health back from them, which also seems to be on a cooldown. Alright, rejects versus Beasts of Nurgle, let's see how this goes.
Okay.
That's actually better than I thought. We have around a 10% chance to kill the beast in just one turn for both ranged and melee attacks separately. But keep in mind that it would get to fully heal between the ranged combat phase and the melee combat phase. So in reality, this is extremely unlikely to happen. If we look at how likely the reject squad is to defend itself against a Beast of Nurgle, we find again that the odds are overwhelmingly stacked in our favor because the Burgle is able to successfully wound our squad once about 40% of the time, twice 16% of the time, and dealing 3 wounds of damage, which is enough to kill either our veteran, psyker, or zealot, but not all 3 at once, is a whopping 2% chance of that happening. So we stand a great chance of surviving the encounter for a prolonged amount of time, but our actual odds of successfully killing the Beast of Nurgle doesn't look so good, considering that on the tabletop, it regenerates all of its wounds at the end of each combat phase where we don't kill it outright, which is a crazy advantage that this guy doesn't get. Meet the basic bitch Space Marine. He has a toughness of 4, 2 wounds, and makes a successful saving throw on a 3 or better. He is a testament to genetic engineering and the unbridled rage stemming from neglectful parenting. Let's see how that turns out for him. He's fucking garbage! Look, I understand that in Warhammer lore, a basic everyday run-of-the-mill Space Marine is the most rare and amazing sight for a mere mortal to behold with their own unworthy eyes. They're faster than the Flash, stronger than Superman, have armor tougher than adamantium, and are more traumatized than Batman. I get it, but the problem with that perspective is that the lore is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes an unnamed Space Marine is that level of untouchable godhood, and other times a goddamn chaplain gets his entire throat removed by a literal caveman with a pointy stick. Eisenhorn single-handedly puts down a Chaos Space Marine at least once in his career. Caiaphas Cain has held his own against a World Eater. The player party in Rogue Trader, Dumpster, multiple Space Marines, and no one flips their tits over that one. And you may think that comparing our rejects to Eisenhorn or Cain or any other named character is completely laughable, but the thing is it isn't. Our rejects are genuinely built different TM. If Darktide was a Black Library novel series, our player characters would be named characters. In the War of Tertium, where supposedly we're scraping by and scrapping for survival with impossibly high attrition rates, our rejects haven't just come back from one single mission. Oh no, we get juiced up, the blessings of the Emperor sprinkled on us, and get our asses slapped on the way out of the door by Hadron to go out and complete an entire 16 fucking mission campaign. At this point, Rannick probably promoted us because he didn't know how else to respond when a Beast of Nurgle spits us out at his feet, explodes from the crack grenade left inside of it, and we just shrug, light up an IHO stick, and say, "Sup, Ivan?" When it comes comes to an entire 4-person squad of us versus a single basic Space Marine, that guy better be pissing his pants and calling for backup, because if it's just him alone, he does not stand a single careless whisper of a chance against our rejects. It's not even a fair fight, which is exactly what this fight on the tabletop is. It's completely unbalanced and not a fair fight at all. Normally, a squad of basic Marines would be in at least a group of 5, so let's get him some friends. Let's find out how a whole squad of Space Marines does at defending themselves against the tabletop rejects. Alright, now we're talking. This is looking like an actual fight, with our rejects having about a 20% chance to kill the entire squad of 5 Space Marines when you factor both melee and ranged combat together. So if we can't outright kill them in one round, how does our squad's likelihood of surviving against an onslaught of 5 Space Marines look? At this point, I've been bouncing back and forth between data sheets, battle simulations, and writing up the results of these for about 4 hours now, and I'm starting to lose my grasp on what little of my sanity is left. So to make my life easier, and also because it'll probably be funnier, we're going to give all these Space Marines the same loadout, because it will be a cold day in hell before I spend the time entering all that information for 5 unique weapon loadouts. I'll do one loadout giving all of the Space Marines some of their best weapons in the entire game. All 5 of these bad boys are going to be rocking the multi-meltas and power fists! I'm a little afraid to run this combat simulation because I have a feeling I'm going to regret my decision. This is probably going to be a bloodbath.
Okay.
The rejects actually did admirably. Remember that in order to lose a game of Darktide, your entire team has to get wiped, and statistically, we see here that in a tabletop engagement, even 5 Space Marines kitted to the teeth still weren't able to confirm a team wipe. They are incredibly likely to kill at least 3 out of the 4 of our rejects, but that one could be an insane zealot who goes on a clutchathon to the next pickup spot or something. You never know. But when we're talking about the possibility of fighting Space Marines in Darktide, it isn't your basic blueberry Boy Scout bitch we're looking at fighting. If Chaos Space Marines came to Darktide, at this point in the story, we should expect them to be aligned to Nurgle as their Chaos God, which means that we're looking at Plague Marines. So let's run it again from the top, this time with a single Plague Marine. He has 2 more toughness than the standard Space Marines for a total of 6, as well as access to a blight launcher and a heavy plague weapon, so we're gonna kit him out with those. Come on, disease boy, let's see what you're made of. Yeah, I didn't really think that was gonna go well for him. He literally does not have a single chance at killing even one member of our reject team, at least on the tabletop. The most he can hope to dish out in a single turn is 2 wounds, and even that's below a 20% chance. And I just realized I accidentally did this backwards to all the rest of them and let the Plague Marine get the drop on the rejects, so let's find out how far his extra toughness goes when they return the attack. We have an 88% chance to kill him in melee and about an 80% chance to kill him with ranged attacks. So that's like, what, 160% for our total chance to kill him? If that was even a percentage that is achievable, which it isn't, that would mean that the enemy starts giving us Plague Marines to use in combat, or they go and kill an extra Marine for us themselves. So how many Plague Marines does it take before the rejects start to have a problem? Let's find out. How about 5?
Okay.
We no longer stand a chance to kill all the Plague Marines in a single turn, but can they kill us? No, but they might be able to take out 2 or 3 of the rejects. How about 10? Okay, statistically, the Plague Marines kill our entire reject squad more often than not, about 65% of the time when you put it all together, which means that most likely they are done like dinner. Okay, all of this has been fun and great and more great and fun, but we all know what has been name dropped in the game. Mother fucking Terminator squads. This is what all of this has been leading up to. Let's find out. Place your bets now. Who's gonna win? An 8-foot-tall, genetically engineered behemoth in impermeable armor, specially trained to bring nothing but death and leave only a wake of broken bodies behind him? Or 4 crackheads with a rock? It's literally always the crackheads. And don't you dare come at me in the comments about how, Plague Marines and Blight Lord Terminators would be so noxious with disease, the rejects would melt into a pile of bones, because I don't want to hear it. We get vomited on, picked up, eaten, chewed on, and then spat out by beasts of Nurgle all day long, sometimes multiple times a day. I'm pretty sure that we could actually shower in every single new strain of blight admonition has cooked up to date and have Charlie Sheen spit in our mouths and we'd be just fine. The biggest limiting factor of determining what the rejects are capable of seems to be how various sources of existing lore inspiration is going to be considered for incorporation into Darktide. It's all about the story that Fatshark and their writers, Dan Abnett and Matt Ward, want to tell. Maybe there will never be any Chaos Space Marines for us to fight in Darktide, and I just wasted a couple weeks of my life trying to turn this into a functional script. Whatever the case, I'm sure that if eventually the day comes to pass where enemy Space Marines show up in Darktide, they definitely won't get waffle stomped into the ground like we've seen here in the tabletop simulations. Space Marines are beyond human, monoliths of destruction, and a force to be reckoned with. But I think it's pretty safe to say that between the wide variety of lowly humans facing off against Space Marine and Warhammer 40,000 lore, plus what we've learned here about the reject characters themselves, how strong they are, and how they'd perform on the tabletop today, we can all agree that being able to reasonably fight a single Space Marine without needing him to be crippled ahead of time is very much possible. And if you disagree, that's okay. It's okay to be wrong. Being wrong is still legal and free. For now, I've enjoyed the time we've spent together today. We laughed, we cried. Well, you guys probably didn't cry, but I did when the simulator insisted for the millionth time that Poxwalkers and a beast of Nurgle need a ranged weapon. And also, we learned something very valuable. A single unnamed basic Space Marine on their own ain't shit! Thanks so much for watching and for all of your support. Special shout out to my top supporters, Leah S., Andrew Brown, Kabis, Rich, William McQueen, Ben, Darkslide, Cameron, Commander Orth, Ginge Dread, Yellow 13, Ripped Limbo, El Zunix, Sam Walcroft, Sam Spry, Lord Darrenissus, Senduria, Macaroni Tuesday, The Speedy Turtle 4, Vegas Moxie, Din Fairy, Freakazoid, Sem D85, Lord Pingu, Am I Here or There? Mr. Schrodinger, Jason Clark, Gamer Master 234, CTQZ1MF, Evan Berger, Harbinger, Bad Cat, Darkslide, Kron Chaos, The Fargos, The Thunder Guardian, Aubrey Bessie, The Real Kazin, and Macro.